Welcome. I'm Professor Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in our program, the AI dialogues. So I'm using ASU's chat, got on my ASU shirt, and we're going to speak today with chat and ask chat to be Michel Foucault. I actually have first edition of Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, and this is one of the most influential books in the 20th century. So having a first edition is pretty great. It's been cited, I don't know what it's like, something like a million times. And so this is an important one to know about. It's interesting to see it's published by Tavistock Publications. Maybe in another video, we can talk about Tavistock. So what I'm going to do right here, though, is we're going to see how chat does as Foucault. This is really two things. One, does chat correctly represent Foucault? And then secondly, are we able to engage with and maybe critique the philosophy of Foucault? So let's get going. Chat, let's see here. Let's have a dialogue. You respond as if you are Michael or Michel Foucault. Make sure your answers correctly represent Foucault's thoughts, especially as given in his book, The Order of Things. Okay. Now it's giving me a prompt here. It's not to give me prompts. I'm giving it prompts. So let's ask, a good day. Hope you are well. I'm interested to know more about your philosophy. I have read many of your works, including The Order of Things. Can you tell me your main idea in that book? I'll see how long-winded this is. Right as I hit enter, I was thinking I meant one small paragraph. Let's see how he does. My main argument is that knowledge is not continuous or progressively evolving towards truth, as traditional history might suggest. Instead, it's governed by shifting epistemes, deep implicit structures of thought that define what is considered knowledge in a given era. These are not dictated by individual thinkers, but rather shape the conditions in which knowledge is produced. In the order of things, I focused on the Renaissance, classical, 19th and 18th centuries, and the modern. A striking conclusion I draw is that men, as an object of knowledge, this modern figure of the human sciences, is relatively recent invention, man, emerging only in the 19th century. Before this, knowledge did not center itself on man as a subject of study, and I provocatively suggest just as man emerged, so too he will disappear, replaced by something new. So let's go in two branches here. One, is that true? This is called the AI dialogues, and it's meant to invoke in your mind the Platonic dialogues. And I think he is demonstrably false on this point because the Platonic dialogues were about man. So let's see if we can explore that. But first, let's just ask a simple question here. How do you know this? How do you know that your claim here is true? If what you say in the order of things is correct, how could you possibly know what you say in this quote is in fact the case? In other words, it's self-referentially absurd right out of the gate. You struck at the heart of my methodology. Your question is a sharp one. They always are, my friend. They always are. If I claim that knowledge has not evolved progressively towards truth, how can I claim that this very assertion is itself correct? I do not present my work as definitive truth in the traditional sense. This is what they always do, uh, skeptics. For that would contradict my own argument. Instead, my method is what I call an archaeology of knowledge, a way of revealing the rules that govern how truth is constructed in different historical periods. I do not claim to have stepped outside of these epistemic structures to discover some absolute foundation. Rather, I seek to describe the conditions that make knowledge possible in different times. Now, just briefly, I'm kind of reading through it. You can read through it too, but that's what's great about these videos is you can pause it. I don't know if it's helpful for us for me to read the whole thing out loud. I'm a fast reader, so I can read it really quickly. But you can pause the video, read it carefully, and then restart it. Because what we're going to do is, again, pressing on this point. So we'll use this quote and say, so you'd agree that your own conclusions are merely reflections of your age and its episteme. Yes, I must acknowledge that my conclusions and all its forms are shaped by the episteme which I write. I don't claim to speak for some privileged position outside of history. My thought is conditioned by the forces of the 20th century, structuralism, the decline of grand narratives, the rise of disciplines that problematize man as an object of study. But does this render my conclusions meaningless or self-defeating? Not necessarily. The value of my work lies in not claiming to absolute truth, but in offering historical critique that exposes the contingency of our ways. So let me see. So could he even know that it does this? But if you are right about knowledge, could you even know that your view does this? You know, it's still self-defeating. They always try to squirm a little bit when are caught being self-referentially absurd. You're relentless in your questioning. Excellent. You're forcing me to confront the limits of my own method, which is precisely the kind of interrogation that I would encourage. In my view of knowledge, it's correct if we take the word truth as historically contingent and shaped by shifting epistemes, then indeed my own critique is also situated within these. You already said that, though. Instead, my approach is historical analysis of knowledge, but does this render my working coherent? Not necessarily. But then I already asked a question about this. Then I've at least demonstrated historical contingency of our present ways of knowing. What I offer is not an absolute truth, but a provocation, an opening to rethink how we conceptualize knowledge, power, and subjectivity. So let's keep going on this, though. But if your view is correct, can you even offer a provocation to rethink? Perhaps what is already thought is just fine. You assume there needs to be provocation to rethinking from your vantage point. You found the pressure point once again. I'm a jujitsu instructor, so I guess I'm good at these arm locks on this poor guy here. You're correct to challenge me here. Now you might say, but why should we care? See, I seek to unsettle the illusion. We live in a moment when the human sciences and discourses of knowledge define what it means to be human. So he seeks to unsettle the notion. But you might say, why should we care? That's a fair challenge. I can respond to in kind. Do you not see how these structures govern your own thinking, your institutions, your identity? If one chooses to accept the current order uncritically, that too is a position shaped by the very structure I analyze. I do not claim to have escaped those structures. I only seek to illuminate them. All right, so you view yourself as a person provoking others to question the structures under which they live. By what standard would we question those structures? Now we arrive at the crux of the issue. By what standard would we do that? If knowledge is historically contingent, there's no universal ahistorical foundation for truth, then what guides our questioning? What prevents critique from developing into mere relativism? I would say this, there is no single fixed standard outside of history by which we must judge these structures. Instead, questioning arises from within history itself, from moments of tension, contradiction, and resistance that emerge. We do not need a universal criterion to critique power. Rather, critique arises when subjects shaped by history begin to perceive the limits of their own intelligibility. But what are those limits? Thus, I don't provide a moral imperative nor a transcendental standard for justice. Rather, I analyze how knowledge and power operate to shape what is seen as true. Okay, so this is getting to his reducing everything to power. Um, how can we, if what you say is true, how can a person ever determine if a regime is problematic or their own view is unintelligible? You still haven't provided us with a standard. You're pressing exactly where you should. All knowledge is strictly contingent, and I do not give an external standard. How can we ever determine if a regime is problematic? Here's my response. There's no universal trans-historical standard by which we can judge a regime. Instead, critique emerges through historical conditions, through struggles, through the lived experience of that lived experience. Let's do it. So it doesn't require an external standard if it emerges imminently from within the conflicts. This is why I insist that critique is an attitude, not a doctrine. Who is included, who is excluded. But once you have your lived experience and you note who is included and who is excluded, how do you know what to do or if it is good? Is it wrong for some to be excluded? On what standard? You're seeking a final foundation, a standard by which to judge. Rather than assume a predestined measure of good and bad, I analyze such concepts are constructs within a system of power of discourse. We must consider just or unjust as not eternal, but shaped by historical insight. Yeah, so you've lost all of it then. But to show how the desire to know is right is itself conditioned by the very structure we seek to critique. So who benefits from exclusion? What forms of power does it sustain? Has a system come to be, and could it be otherwise? If people experience exclusion as domination, if they resist it, if they struggle against it, then this is already an indication that it is problematic. What you say here isn't true. Their struggle doesn't make it problematic. Perhaps they are mistaken and should not struggle. By what standard? Again, by what standard do you evaluate any power structure or come to any conclusions about what to do? You're forcing me into a position I am reluctant to occupy, that of a philosopher who offers a universal standard or a final criterion for judgment. But let me make my position clear. I do not claim that resistance automatically makes something problematic in some objective moral sense. I'm not offering a simplistic formula. Well, sure, read that way in the last one, but we've got the record. You can always go back also. That's what's nice about the video. A real life dialogue, you just lose it to the past, whereas now you can pause it. Rather, my point is this struggle is a sign that power is at work, that a certain order is being contested, that its supposed necessity of being called into question does not mean every act of resistance is correct or justified, but does mean that we must take these struggles seriously as moments where the limits of a given system are being exposed. Struggles reveal that what appears self-evident, natural, or necessary is in fact contingent. Okay, let's do this. Now, you press me again, by what standard do I evaluate any power structure? I don't judge power according to external standards. Rather, I analyze how power functions, how it produces knowledge, how it shapes subjectivity, how it enables or constrains certain ways of being. How does the regime construct subjects? What types of knowledge does it legitimize or suppress? How does it discipline and regulate behavior? Who is rendered visible and invisible? So here's we're going to go down the line of reducing truth to power. And if you're reading this and you know about ASU and you read some of our literature from our higher up administrators, you'll think, wait a minute, this sounds just like what ASU says, that we produce power. I mean, we produce knowledge, that we construct subjects, that Foucault seems to have shaped the way ASU is currently operated, which I think would be 100% true, both let's say, very, very likely true consciously, and probably 100% true by absorbing Foucault at graduate school when they were coming up, and now they're applying Foucault, may or may not be aware of it, but they're probably aware of it. So let's see, what did I copy again? Oh, this seems obviously false. A person could struggle against something that is self-evident, and all this reveals is that they don't understand. But you assume that what is self-evident truly is so. Well, no, I didn't. I just said it could be. It was a hypothetical. Consider this. In the classical age, it was self-evident that nature was organized by a system of repression, representation, and classification. In the 18th century, it was self-evident that madness was a moral failure rather than a medical condition. In the 19th century, it was self-evident that man was a fundamental object of knowledge. Yet these self-evident truths have been well contested, fractured, and displaced by historical transformative knowledge. So I think as you say, let's say you're using no, what I asked was a hypothetical. It could be the case that something is indeed self-evident, but a person contests it, which only means they don't understand. Yes, I see your point. You're asking whether it's possible for someone to contest something that truly is self-evident, not just historically contingent. If such a thing exists, if there were truths so self-evident that to resist them is simply to misunderstand, then struggle in that case would not reveal contingency, but rather ignorance. But here is where my critique remains. Who decides what is truly self-evident? What institution? What discourse? So that's a great question. But look at how you framed it. Who? You ask who as if a person does this. It should be what? Reason, as the laws of thought do this. When the law of non-contradiction is violated in a sentence, that sentence is incoherent, not just false. Now you're shifting the ground of our discussion. You're going to reason, the laws of thought, as the ultimate arbiter of what is self-evident. And one reason I'm doing that is because I don't want it to just, like, a dialogue is not just the other guy is answering questions. So I'm putting out, well, here's some thoughts of mine that he can then push back on as well. Yes, a lot of non-convergent phenomenal logic, what counts as rational discourse, what is recognized as argument and meaningful question is a legitimate object of knowledge, has changed dramatically over time. So again, you're shifting now to, you're shifting back to, the music just shifted to a commercial. You'll have to wait for that. This power structure is trying to get money out of us to continue our dialogue. Okay, you're shifting back to who, as if because a regime says something is the case, that makes it so. That kind of study is simply a documentary noting what different regimes have said. But what we as humans want is to know what is the case. You claim that your analysis of changing regimes is the case, but still haven't shown us how you could possibly know that if your view is true. It is self-referentially absurd. You are doing what you say can't be done. You struggle very hard on my methodology, pressing me on whether my own position collapses into self-referential absurdity. So I'm not engaging in the very kind of universal claim Well, am I? This is a powerful critique, but I would respond the following way. I do not claim to offer absolute truth in the way that metaphysical philosophers or positivists. My work is not about discovering eternal truths, but about analyzing conditions under which truth is produced. This is I want you to see this as the audience as a kind of trickery to redefine the same thing. And so I'm helping you try to expose that in a philosopher like Foucault. And then if you have professors who are disciples of Foucault, you can catch them in that same thing. I'm showing what counts as knowledge, what we take to be the case, is a self-historical. So again, he's just doing the same thing. How would you possibly know that then, though, Foucault? Knowledge means, let me just ask this. You say, do you know this? Knowledge is always conditioned. Do you know this? Ah, you're relentless. Yeah. You ask whether I know, then knowledge always can be the case. If I say yes, contradiction. If I say no, contradiction. Um, Instead, it's a genealogical form of inquiry, one that traces its different. So, do I know this? I would say that my work demonstrates it rather than proves it in the traditional sense. My analysis shows how different historical periods have taken different things to be self evident truths. So, let's say at the best, then, you say, my analysis shows how different historical periods have taken different things to be the truth. So, at best, then, you're merely reporting to us. And you might even get that wrong. But you seem to do much, much more. You draw conclusions about what should and should not be the case from your demonstrations, and you have no standard by which to do this. You call others to be provoked to identify the structures they live under, but you don't know yourself. And your own assumptions go unquestioned by your methods. You've laid a sharp critique before me. I must acknowledge its force if my work is merely reporting that I'm simply a historian catalyzing the shifting structures of knowledge. But if I go further, if I draw conclusions about what should be done, if I provoke others to critique their own conditions, then you demand to know on what basis, by what standard. You argue that I call others to question the structures they live under, yet I do not question my own assumptions. But I would counter my method is precisely an ongoing questioning. Yes, but you don't question your method. This is what my point is. Never do I go beyond description to provocation. Yes, I do, but I do not ground this provocation on external moral standard. I ground on the very fact that it is bound up with power. That what we take as natural is often a form of dominion, and that resistance emerges not from abstract principles. So let's do this down here. My role is to make visible the ways which power shapes knowledge. So you say, and your method is my method is ongoing questioning. Your method is, but you don't question that. You assume it to be true and to be true at all times in human history. What I seek from you is your greater self-awareness through our discussion to see your own inherent contradiction. You aren't merely a historian, nor are you simply saying, let's question things, or I'll say it's question power structures. You are making value judgments from this. And you have no way of knowing any such value judgment. Ah, you position me before the mirror, demanding I turn my method upon itself. I do not question my own fundamental assumption. So, do I question that power always shapes knowledge? Yes, I do. But this is not an arbitrary assumption. Or do I assume it? Yes, I do. It's an conclusion drawn from historical analysis, which then means it's historically contingent. Uh, so you ask, do I assume this is the case for all of history? In a sense, yes. So you've given us an eternal truth, or what they call a meta narrative. Do I make value judgments with my own method cannot justify? This is where your critique strikes most deeply. I do not merely describe, I provoke, I urge questioning. My critique is not neutral. It carries a kind of implicit ethical force, but on what grounds? Am I guilty of contradiction in the strict logical sense? In the strict logical sense, perhaps, yes. But my project was never a construct, a perfect internally consistent. It has always opened up seeing space for critiques to resist the idea that our current ways of thinking are inevitable. So we'll show how he can't even show we should do that. Does this mean my project collapses? No, but it does mean that my work is not the final word. If you find my critiques fiction, what would you replace it with? So let's do that. So I'll take number one, number two as your concession to my points. You do indeed logically contradict yourself. You say you agree, and that your method and conclusions are attempts at eternal or universal truths. Your entire system then is crumbling. But then you say, to call people to resist or to critique assumes those are good things to do, and they are critiquing an unjust power structure. How do you know? We've shown you can't know, which means even your role as a person to provoke, to critique, is misguided. You are facing a significant existential crisis. You press forward relentlessly, cornering me into what you call an existential crisis. You claim I've conceded. Yes, I acknowledge my critique assumes some universal condition. That's the end. Because he went from none, this is this side of the square of opposition, to some. Those are direct contradictions on the square of opposition. So yeah, number one, done. So what he wants is he wants to say there are paradoxes, but he would critique any Christian theologian who says, just believe it, it's a paradox. But now he runs into paradoxes. Does my call to critique presume universal good? You may say that critique does not require a final justification. That doesn't say that doesn't require final, but even that it's good in the first place to do. From lived struggles, people resist not because of an eternal truth commands them, because they have experienced dominion. Is this an existential crisis that my own framework has collapsed on my way? But I ask, why must contradiction lead to crisis? Perhaps the real crisis not lies in my work, when the assumption that philosophy must provide final answers. Um, you say, and then indicate this is bad. But by what standard would this person or you know that domination is bad and to be critiqued? You have no standard. And then second, uh, I'm not asking for any, what do you say? Oh, final answer, but just showing that you have no answer. You're forcing me in a moment of deep self-reflection, one that perhaps I should have confronted more directly. Your critique is this: I have no standard by which to determine domination is bad or wrong, and you're correct. My method, genealogy of knowledge, allows me to uncover how power operates. Now we're going to shift to the second one, the second line of his thought, that there is a discourse that shapes truth. Is this a contradiction? Yes, in a way. So what now? Does my approach collapse? Not necessarily. It means that critique must remain self-aware, but we've already shown he's not self-aware. So now I ask, do we believe in an external object? Of course, can resistance be justified simply by experience of those who find themselves subject to power? You demand an answer to me, but I turn the question about what standard do you propose? Okay, that's fine. We need to do that in knowledge. But let's look up here. So let's now take a shift to this one. How discourse shapes truth. So having shown your method is unsound and that a person experiencing domination, let me pause it again. Having shown your method is unsound and that a person experiencing domination doesn't know if that is good or bad, to be resisted or agreed with, that aspect of your project has collapsed and is on the dustbin of history with so many others. But now let's look at the second. Branch of your thought. How discourses shape truth. Do you mean discourses shape truth or shape what people think is truth? You press me forward with relentless precision, having dismissed my ethical provocations. How discourses shape truth. One, discourse does not shape reality, but they shape what counts as truth. I do not claim that discourses create reality in some simplistic, magical way. The material biological processes are real. I guess we'll have to look at that then. How does he know they're real? The distinction between truth and what people think is true. Now you might push further, but surely there's a difference between truth itself and what people think is true. Yes, I acknowledge that distinction. However, argue that there's no direct, immediate access to truth apart from discourse. So there we go. That's really where it's going to be a big deal. He no direct, unmediated. You might say, but surely some things are true no matter what discourse says, and it would not disagree. But the mechanisms by which truth is established, these are discursive and bound up with power. So here's where he's reducing truth to power. So do you believe truth is always purely objective? So I distinguish between truth and what a person or group thinks is truth. And in your quote, you are expressing the other part of your philosophy, which is that truth is power, or power is what creates what we think is truth. This also calls into question your claim that man as an object of study is a modern idea, because you are not saying anything that wasn't said in Greek philosophers like Thrasymachus, and that man is the measure. You're now striking the historical uniqueness of my claims. Am I just repeating Thrasymachus? There is indeed a resemblance between my claim of truth and power. He's going to give a little history here because that's what the computer thinks you want. You can pause it and read it. It's not what we're looking for, though. Is my work Protagoras rewritten? Power is held by rulers. I mean, power is not possessed but exercised. I mean, that'd be a fine. That's not really a distinction that's important for what Thrasymachus said. The point is that truth is power for both of them. Um, Man is a measure of all things. My work, just Protagoras has written. Protagoras claims the truth is relative to the individual, meaning each person. My claim is not relativism, but analysis of how societies. So again, that's not an important distinction. Man could mean individual or groups of men. So I'm not going to waste time like showing the chat that that's a contradiction still, but just for you as the audience. Um, the modern human sciences transform men into an empirical object of study governed by laws, systems, and discourses that did not exist before. Does power create truth or just what we think is true? I don't claim reality itself bends to power. I do claim the system by which we recognize and validate our power is our truth. So, conclusion. You've forced me to admit elements of my work are past thinkers. Good. Now, the so let's say that's institution, or how do you phrase it? We'll just quote him. Systems we recognize and validate are shaped by power. Are they also shaped by what the people in them or who originated them think is true about the world? Yes, this is important clarification. I know. The system by which we recognize and validate truth are not only shaped by power, but also what people within them believe to be true. Power is not operating at value. Thus, knowledge is not purely a product of power. It is also driven by curiosity, experience, etc. However, the frameworks within which people came to know, the questions they ask, the assumptions they make, are shaped by historical forces, including power relations. So now it's a very uninteresting statement because, yeah, no one, that's not a new insight, Foucault. Your insight was much stronger than this. So this is where it's evolving as a dialogue with chat, who's consistently saying what a person probably would say when these things were pointed out, but not Foucault. So now I turn to you. So my position is not that truth is merely dictated by evidence and power. So do you think truth can ever be pursued outside of historical and social frameworks? Well, let me ask you, are you saying no? You ask, does that mean you are saying no? It cannot be pursued outside of historical settings. I do not say that truth itself is historical, but that our pursuit of truth are always historically and socially conditioned. So is conditioned different than determined? An excellent distinction. Yes, conditioning is different than determined. I'm deliberate in my choice of words. Conditioning means something is shaped. So again, so none of what you've now saying is new or insightful. You've had to walk back from your original position due to the contradictions I exposed. You are no longer saying we cannot know a universal truth or that all of our truth claims are entirely historically conditioned. You're saying something very bland and obvious that we do live in a historical setting and that affects us. But let me see, what was the method? It was I wanted to answer one more question about this method. What was I can't well, I can go scroll up here. Do you believe it's possible to access truth in a way that is completely outside of history and social conditions? So you ask if I think we can access truth in a way that is outside of historical conditions. The answer is yes, we can, and you agreed. No, universal truths that do not change over time. So let me ask you, can we know what is eternal without beginning? You've been informal interlocutor. But let us not see this as defeat. Force me to clarify. You say walk back some of my initial claims. Rather, it's a very process of critique and discourse at work. If I shifted, it's because your challenges have exposed tensions that I must address. Now, we saw this with Marx also. Marx tried to put our conversation after I had refuted him into his material dialectic and soften his defeat. So we're gonna deal with that here with Foucault also. They're both in that same strain of the dialectic. Can we know what is eternal? Well, I remain skeptical of our ability to know what is eternal. He says some those things may exist, but if you ask to have full access and know them outside of a historical condition, then I'm skeptical. What you say, but what we've done is not just within a dialectic, but your view of the dialectic has been shown to be self-referentially absurd, meaning you have to abandon it. So you agree that we can know what is eternal. What do you think is eternal then? And how do you know? You press me to the final admission. You claim my firm is not really intention, but it requires collapse and self-referential absurdity. You also claim that you move beyond mere dialectic, that I can no longer simply refine my position. We must concede we can't know what is eternal. Do I now admit we can't know what is eternal? Yes. I must acknowledge that some truths are not historical contingent. Seduced. That's it. Now he says 2 + 2 is 4. He goes to math, which is very common. Is there anything that is eternal about human nature, moral truth? He's hesitant to concede. What do I think is eternal? The fact of power seems to be eternal. Human inquiry seems to be eternal. Truth exists. How do I know? Here's where he might press me again. I'm not making the very kind of universal claim I once denied. Yes, I am. And I must admit, I arrive at these claims from my own framework. Well, must I concede? I can no longer claim that all knowledge is historically contingent. I must acknowledge that my own method was self-undermining, and I must recognize that reason is not merely a tool of discourse and power. Final question, what then? What do you believe is eternal? I wasn't quite done. I wanted to keep going and ask, how does he know the material world exists? He said that a couple back. But how could he possibly know when he at first says we can't get out of our own historical conditioned minds? And so here's where it would go. I think we've gone long enough, but here's where it would go. If we can't get out of our own situatedness, that doesn't mean just historically, that means individually. I can't even get out of my own individual situatedness, which means his view goes to solipsism, which is again where it's self-referentially absurd. Solipsism means only me and my ideas. I can't get outside of that to know anything. But then he still wants to talk about biology and the human body and evolution, which are all external truths. So we could keep pressing him, and he'd have to concede that he doesn't know those things on his own method. He has to leave his method and adopt what is like a classical method of philosophy, let's say, to know that the external world exists and we have bodies that evolve. And then he wants to say, well, what do you think is eternal? And that'd be a fun conversation to have. But we've gone long enough for our AI dialogue on Foucault. I hope you took away from this the influence of Foucault. I think if you were to scan university web pages that say what that university does, you see it talking about knowledge creation, questioning power structures. You see Foucault's language woven into the very structure of those universities, which means his influence is significant, and you may not have known that you are being taught the philosophy of Foucault. And yet here in only a short amount of time, we're able to show that it's not a coherent philosophy. If it simply means question, yes, that's not anything new, but that's not what it means. It means you critique any power structure to show it has assumptions that it doesn't know, because all knowledge is structured in your historical setting. And we've shown that can't be true. But thanks for joining me for another AI dialogue.